This is a story about a number of families called Hawke from a small region of North Cornwall. They ended up in the Cornish settlement of New South Wales in the 19th century. The families all came from a region around Newquay, today a major town in Cornwall, but at the time of this story it was just a collection of a few houses for fishermen. Unlike many stories of Cornish emigration, this is not about miners but about everyday rural people. I've focused on the Hawke family because it is a typical example of how the Cornish, with a deep sense of community and Methodism, emigrated to the other side of the world but retained their Cornishness. On the 3rd of March 1838, George Hawke married his cousin Jane Hawke in Tregonner Chapel, St Evell, Cornwall. It was probably one of the very first weddings at this tiny chapel that had only just been completed. George was one of at least 10 children born to bedridden farmer Thomas Hawke and his wife Jane. You would probably class Thomas as a yeoman, as he owned his own farm. Thomas and Jane had married in 1783 and had a child virtually every 2 years. The bride was one of 4 children born to George's uncle Robert and his wife Mary. Uncle Robert and Aunt Mary had married in 1794 and had set up home in Bodmin, about 8 miles inland from Bedrethen. Their first child, Jenny, died in 1804, and they'd also lost a son before Jane married. Indeed, by the time of her wedding, Jane had also lost her mother and her father, and her only surviving family member was a sister. It appears very likely that Jane and her sister had moved to live either close to or with her Uncle Thomas at Bedrethen. Bedrethen is and was a small hamlet in the parish of St Evell, just to the north of Newquay. Today, Bedrethen is famous as a tourist destination, with its rock formations that mirror the Australian 12 Apostles. Well, nearly. George, aged 36 when he married, had already had an eventful life. Indeed, much of his life has been extensively chronicled, as he became a significant figure in the Australian agricultural world in New South Wales. Several texts are devoted to detailed accounts of George's life, particularly the paper by Eric Ramsden, George Hawke of Pendarvis, a pioneer of the Cornish settlement. So I will merely outline his life story and focus more on his motive for leaving and the families that were left behind in Cornwall. George was born in 1802 with at least 7 older siblings, including 4 brothers, John, Thomas, Philip and Samuel. 2 other brothers were born after George, Robert in 1806 and William in 1808. These both feature along with Samuel in George's later life. The beginning of the 19th century, when almost 50% of the British population was employed in agriculture, was a period of immense change in British society, as it transformed from one based on agriculture to one based on manufacturing as the Industrial Revolution accelerated. The shift from rural to urban societies. Nowhere was this change more significant than in Cornwall, where mining of the important metals of tin, copper, lead and zinc stimulated the development of an engineering industry focused by the emerging steam engine technology. While steam engines built to designs by Thomas Newcomen and later James Watt had been available from the mid-18th century, they were very inefficient and required huge quantities of coal that were not readily available in Cornwall. Watt and his business partner Matthew Bolton had successfully patented their steam engine and obtained an Act of Parliament preventing development from their original designs. As their engines operated at very low pressures, little more than atmospheric, they could not deliver the power required to pump water from the deep mines that were being developed in Cornwall. People like Richard Trevithick, the Harveys and the Holman families, and even incomers such as the Hornblowers from Staffordshire attempted to circumvent the patents, but often ended in court. However, once the Act of Parliament terminated in 1800, steam engine development in Cornwall accelerated at a rapid pace. High-pressure Cornish boilers, triple expansion engines, improved linkages all contributed to much more powerful and efficient machines. Indeed, as early as 1801, Trevithick had demonstrated the potential for steam-powered vehicles with his Going Up Cambourne Hill, Puffing Devil. These improved engines allowed mines to go deeper and increased productivity of both raw and processed ores, all of which contributed to the wealth of the industry. This hotbed of innovation established an education and training system that delivered a new breed of professional engineers and technicians who were sought after across the globe. Naturally, the landowners prospered, and families such as the Rashleys at Menabilly, the Boscorns at Tregothnan, the Robarts at Lanhydrock, the Bassets at Tehiddy, and Hawkins at Trewithen became very, very rich. Indeed, because of the tribute system, whereby miners benefited from the profits of the ore that they recovered, even they shared in the industrial boom, and mine landowners encouraged their workers to enclose small parcels of land on which they could grow vegetables and keep a few animals, such as a cow or pig, for their food. Some mine owners also established a form of health insurance to cover loss of earnings through illness and injury. Coupled with the higher wages in the mining industry and the loss of common land through the Enclosure Acts of the late 18th and 19th centuries, there was a reluctance for unskilled labourers to remain in agriculture. In addition, as more land was enclosed and managed by fewer landowners, new farming practices such as crop rotation and mechanisation increased productivity and reduced the need for manual labourers. Social problems arose as thousands of unskilled men returned home following the wars in continental Europe, with limited prospects of employment in traditional agriculture. The improved availability of food and rising public health conditions added to a dramatic increase in population from around 9 million in 1801 to 35 million by the end of the century. Inevitably, homegrown crops could not keep pace with the demand, and this led to significant imports, particularly of corn. Many wealthy landowners were unhappy with these cheaper imports, and as they very much dominated Parliament, they brought in laws such as the Corn Law in 1815 to set tariffs on imported corn. However, the rapid growth of the urban centres focused on mining and manufacturing, particularly the cotton industry, spelt the end of the rural-based economy. And in 1832, the Reform Act abolished the corrupt rotten boroughs, where small communities and the sway of the local landowner would return a disproportionate number of MPs. There were 13 of these in Cornwall. And they created a much wider representational parliament, albeit still with a restricted electorate. On top of this, there were a number of disastrous harvests in 1816 and 1817. 1816 was called the year without a summer and resulted from the massive volcanic eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in the previous year. This was the biggest explosion in recorded history and had a major impact on climate across the globe, including in Britain. By 1817, many farm labourers had been made redundant, and these people put extreme pressures on the poorhouses that were financed by local taxes at this time. The end result of all these converging influences was what became known as the agricultural distress across Britain in the 1820s. As farmers, the Hawke family was much affected by the parlous state of agriculture in the early 19th century. The farm was incapable of supporting their ever-expanding family, and George, as their fifth and sickly son, had to work as a merchant buying and selling wood in the local district. However, in common with many agriculture-related industries, this too was under pressure from overseas imports, especially from the cotton industry that had become the powerhouse driving the Industrial Revolution. George was probably inspired to try his luck in Australia through the influence of a number of Cornish Methodists that included the Reverend Walter Lawrie from Rutherland near Bodmin. He had also met with William Toms and William Lane from Blissland, who travelled to Australia 5 years before George decided to go. There is even a possible connection with his uncle Robert, who lived near Bodmin, and hence to his future bride, Jane. George eventually tried to leave Plymouth in January 1828 on board the 318-ton brig Jessie Lawson. Sadly, this 4-year-old ship was wrecked, along with several others, during what the papers described as a dreadful hurricane in Plymouth Sound. He was more successful in June, and he left on a 300-ton schooner, the Henry Wellesley, and arrived in Australia some 6 months later. He carried letters of introduction from Lawrie, although these proved worthless, but he did meet with the Tom and Lane families in the Cornish settlement between Orange and Bathurst. They provided short-term employment for George, schooling their children. His first few years in Australia were heavily influenced by the Wesleyan community, and this strong religious framework provided him with stability while he began to settle into his new way of life. This included some sheep and cattle farming with John Glasson, another immigrant from Cornwall. In fact, George gave up his teaching roles to manage his farm and set up his home at Pendarvis, a property he bought from John Glasson. At this time, in 1837, he decided that he was sufficiently established to look for a wife, and he asked his cousin Jane back in Cornwall if she would marry him. Indeed, at this time, Jane's widowed father, Robert, was planning to emigrate himself, but the loss of his son discouraged him, and as I've said, he too died soon afterwards. Jane agreed to marry George on the condition that he came back within 2 years. Again, George's history of disasters followed him, and he was marooned at Hokianga River in New Zealand after a ship, the bark James Lang, had been very badly damaged. The ship had little more luck than George, because it had already suffered serious damage off Portsmouth on her outward journey. George was very critical of the Anglican missionaries that he saw in New Zealand because of their approach to undermining the traditions of the native Maori people. George did eventually manage to find another passage on board the Pyramus, a 5-year-old 360-ton bark that sailed from Hokianga on the 7th of August 1837, and after some severe weather arrived off Plymouth on the 9th of October. George described the trip as a long and tiresome journey. After arrival, he travelled on to his father's farm at Bedruthen to meet with his future bride. After their wedding at Tregonna Methodist Chapel on the 3rd of March, they set sail back to Australia on board the bark Florentia. Although texts suggest they left from London, it's far more likely that they boarded the newly refurbished ship in Plymouth, where she departed on the 4th of April with around 60 passengers. The passenger list notes not only G. Hawkson family, agriculturalist, but also an S. Hawkson family. I'm presuming that this is his older brother Samuel and his wife Sally. The Florentia arrived in Sydney on the 3rd of August in the middle of a very harsh drought. The arrival was not reported in the UK papers until December, which highlights the timescales for news to travel from the new to the old in the 19th century. It was not until the telegraph cable was completed between Britain and Australia in 1871 that communication speeds would improve. As described in the reports of George's life, all the young trees and hawthorn seeds that he had transported with him failed to survive. However, he was convinced that the climate and soil in the region of Orange and Bathurst were ideal for the fruit trees, and through his persistence, he established a very successful apple and cherry growing business with specimens brought from both Britain and Tasmania. George and his fellow Cornish agriculturalists also realised that the emerging copper industry would bring many people to the area who would need to be fed. Even after William Tom's son discovered gold in 1851 and started a gold rush, George stuck to his farming rather than be seduced by the opportunity to seek his fortune through mining. He reckoned that the value of his sheep and cattle would rise as thousands of people rushed into the goldfields. He was also very disparaging of the lack of religion among the miners. George and Jane had one daughter, Mary Wilkinson Hawke, in 1849, and she provides another connection back to Cornwall. Close to the Bedruthen Hawkes, there was another scion of the Hawke family who were based in the Newlyn East, Cubert and Crantock area. Another George Hawke. Yes, there are lots and lots of George Hawkes. Was born in Newlyn East in 1805. He went on to farm in both Crantock, a Triego farm, and briefly near Cubert at Ellen Glaze. George was a cousin of the Hawke family at Bedruthen, and he married a local Bedruthian, Mary Roberts, in 1833. George and Maria went on to raise 5 children. In 1836, the Whig Party under Lord Melbourne passed the Tithe Commutation Act. This act was introduced to simplify the settlement of tithes across England and Wales. Tithes were originally introduced in 855 by Ethelwulf, the King of Wessex, as an annual tax based on 1/10 of all agricultural produce to support the local church and clergy. After the Reformation in the 16th century, much of the land held by the church was passed to lay owners who also inherited the right to receive tithes, as well as becoming the recognised landowners. From the tithes collected, the lay owners were obligated to provide funds to secure and maintain a clergy to serve the parish. By the 19th century, there was an increasing trend towards replacing produce with an appropriate sum of money that would often be added as a supplement to the rent paid by the tenant. The Tithe Commutation Act was an attempt to regularise the collection of tithes based on a monetary tax, rather than through in-kind produce. To operate, the Act required a detailed understanding of the land ownership and use within every tithe district. This led to the first accurate set of maps of England that were linked to written schedules that identified every parcel of land with a unique reference number, noted on the map, the landowner, the occupier, the state of cultivation, pasture, arable, etc., the area, and rent or the tithe payable. The Crantock apportionment of the rent charge in lieu of tithes was completed on the 22nd of February 1840, with a map drawn in 1839 by one Alexander Withers. The tithe documents were very useful as their publication coincided with the first accurate census of the UK population in 1841. This census provided first name and surname, age, sex, occupation, and whether they were born in the county of everybody that was living in the parish on the 6th of June 1841. Censuses were conducted every 10 years, and most of this information, up to 1911, is available online through bodies such as Ancestry. The tithe and census documents identify that George was the occupier at Triego, but only the joint owner, having gone into partnership with John Dungy, another farmer from Illugan, in the centre of the Cornish mining district around Redruth and Camborne. 5 years after the census in 1846, the Triego Hawks' final child, William, was born. George's wife, Maria, died when William was 11, and George Sr. was left at Triego with his youngest son, William, and daughter, Ellen, all the others having flown the nest, including George Jr. to Australia, where I believe he died in 1904. The farm halved in size to around 60 acres, and by 1881, the local miller, Francis Stevens, had acquired it. In 1876, George's youngest son, William, also decided to emigrate to Australia, almost certainly to join up with his older brother in Bathurst. There, he met Mary Wilkinson Hawke, and they were married in Byng on the 1st of June 1876. News of their marriage was carried in the Royal Cornwall Gazette in September. They had 3 daughters, and William became part of the extended Hawke family, farming in and around Byng. He clearly prospered as he became, like his father-in-law, a justice of the peace for the region, and in 1882, on the death of his fruit farming father-in-law, William took over Pendarvis with his wife, Mary Wilkinson. Mary Wilkinson Hawke had a sad life, and in 1896, William returned from a carriage drive to discover that his wife had hanged herself in the barn of the Pendarvis farm. The inquest confirmed that Mary had suffered serious mental health issues, almost certainly postnatal depression, and she had been detained in the Parramatta Hospital for the Insane in around 1886. She had only been released a short while before her suicide. Her husband lived a further 8 years and died in 1904. But what of those that were left behind in Cornwall? At Bedruthen, I found no trace of 2 older brothers, who I suspect died as children. Brother Philip went on to have his own farm of over 120 acres close to Bedruthen, and he brought up 5 children, the eldest of which eventually took over the farm. Samuel, I'm sure, had gone to Australia with George, and Robert also ended up in the Cornish settlement, having first travelled to the USA. So in the end, the Bedruthen farm passed down to the youngest son, William, who was 6 years George's junior. William took over the farm at around the time that George married Jane, and by 1851, William had married Jane Trethewey Gilbert and moved into his father-in-law's farm at Trinance in St Morgan, literally a stone's throw down the road from Bedruthen. William amalgamated the Bedruthen and Trinance farms to double his holding. They now have 8 children, as well as Jane's 82-year-old father, all living together, They also had a servant, Thomas Toms, undoubtedly from the Toms family that had been so supportive to brother George. By 1861, there had been a dramatic change in circumstances, not least because they now had 10 children, aged between 5 and 23, all living at home. William appears to have given up farming and is now head of a drapery and tailoring business on the high street in St. Cullum Major. He has employed a milliner from Bermondsey and drapers assistants, all living at the same address in Bank Street. But things were to change again, and within 10 years, only Jane is still living in Bank Street, together with 2 of her children. Her husband had died at the age of 59 in 1867. However, their eldest son, William Thomas Hawke, and his family continued the drapery business in St. Cullum for at least another 30 years. And what of the Crantock Hawkes? William had 3 sisters, Elizabeth, Maria, and Ellen. Elizabeth married Henry Penlerick from Falmouth about 10 years before William set off for Australia. Henry ran a large drapery business in Falmouth with a shop at 27 Market Street. Over the next 10 years, they had 7 children, all of whom stayed at home with them until at least 1881. They also inherited William's father, George, from Crantock, who had moved to Falmouth after selling Triago Farm, and he died in Falmouth in 1882. Elizabeth's sister Maria married into another farming family, Joseph Robertons from Withiel in 1868. Joseph had a large farm by Cornish standards at that time, again called Trinance, that was part of the Lanhydrock estate. It was 232 acres, just under 100 hectares, and employed 4 labourers. From newspaper cuttings, he and his father, who farmed nearby, exhibited both cattle and crops at local agricultural shows, winning first prize for his turnips one year at Bodmin Show. Joseph and Maria raised 6 children. In 1872, he organised a ploughing and hedging competition that a local newspaper described as the first and last because of an acrimonious dispute over the result, a view that was strongly rejected by Joseph in a letter to the Royal Cornwall Gazette. The youngest daughter, Ellen, did not marry until 1875, when she married John Hocking, who was 20 years her senior. John was a district surveyor of highways, and they lived in Tregony near Truro, where Ellen had 2 children, James and George. So over a period of around 50 years, a group of people from 2 branches of the Hawkes, who lived within a relatively small area of Cornwall, had established a foothold within an entirely new country, retaining their family ties, religious convictions, occupations, and their friendships. Indeed, it is almost a rebirth as their Cornish roots withered and the Australian shoots prospered and grew. A prime example of the assertiveness of the Cornish identity. These people were not from the more widely recognised mining communities, but agriculturalists who recognised that farming in Britain was getting increasingly difficult and that there were exciting opportunities offered by Australia. Its climate, fertility, large farm, its lack of established landowners and the almost feudal systems that existed in Cornwall, and all the new emigrants that were moving to the area. Today, there are few signs of the Hawke family name in or around Crantock, and no Cornish Hawkes ever became Prime Minister of the UK, unlike Robert Hawke of Australia. And today, Australia has another in Alex Hawke, the Minister for Immigration. In fact, to look at the family names from the 1840s shows that very few have survived. Very few, if any, Hawkes, Searles, Praters, Houses, Johns, Martins, Carivicks, Jenkins, Stevens, or Check-Widdens can be found in the Crantock parish. The Hawke family is typical of many of these 19th century families, where the menfolk dispersed both abroad and to the rapidly growing urban areas such as London. Those who remained found that agriculture could not sustain their large families, and sons had to move into retail businesses, while the daughters married outside the farming communities. Indeed, several Hawkes made it into the drapery business, and I can remember a Madam Hawke dress shop in Newquay in the 1950s, although probably not an immediate descendant from the Hawke families in this story. Even in the last few days, during a search for pictures on Flickr, I came across one of Bathurst, where another Cornishman had popped up, Edmund Webb. from my birth town of Liscard. He clearly followed his Cornish roots as he opened a very successful drapery business. A high concentration of Cornish in the region has probably ensured that even today there is a very strong bond to their homeland. It would be interesting to know how many of the common 19th century names survive overseas in places like Australia. Indeed, one wonders whether the Cornish diaspora are no more Cornish than the Cornish in Cornwall. How many societal and cultural factors have also migrated to foreign parts along with their family names? Are there songs, stories, dialect terms and traditions that once thrived in Cornwall, now only present abroad?